hope that I can live up to that in some small way. Yeah, so I'm a journalist. I'm not a game designer or an academic researcher. I've been covering video games for about 10 years on and off now. When I first started, it was 2001. And as Scott was saying, the landscape was very, very different. Everybody thought I was completely insane for wanting to cover video games. They just thought, you know, back in 2001, video games were still something that made you stupid and were probably leading to the moral decay of our society. And so I was sort of curious, well, what is this world? What are these things? And, you know, what do they have to teach us? The thing that really made me interested in video games in the first place was something a saying that I had heard when I was a kid. When I was raised by hippies, and I got taken to a bunch of alternative game festivals when I was a kid in the 70s, and new games. So we would do things like, remember, like push the big ball around the field to learn about cooperation. And I remember it being explained to me that not all games had to be zero-sum games, and that games could foster kind of anything you wanted them to foster, and it just depended on how you built them. And one of the sayings that I remember going around when I was a kid that really made an impression on me was, show me the games of your children and I'll show you the next 100 years. And it was something that comes from anthropology, and it was this idea that, you know, play is how primates learn. And games are the way that a society fosters the skills and the modes of thinking that it wants in its adults of the future. So when I first got approached about writing a book about video games, I thought, well, this is actually really interesting, because if I study the games of our children, I'm actually going to get a sense of what kind of people we're creating and a little bit what the future might look like. And one of the first things I realized right away when I went in was that playing games do not make you stupid. Which we probably all accepted now, but again, back in 2001 and 2002, this would still kind of freak people out when I said it. And I remember spending tons of time with gamers and game developers and game designers, and I was thinking about what kinds of intelligence video games were fostering. And I remember at the beginning, I didn't really know how to identify it. I had a sense that it was a specific kind of intelligence that had to do with logic, that it had to do with understanding cause and effect, maybe scientific thinking, building hypothesis, and something about it struck me as very male. I didn't know how to define that really at the time, but that was kind of the sense that I had. Okay, so since then, I wrote my book about video games in 2005, and then since then, I covered games for a while, and then I've actually gotten, what kept me around and really inspired me was this sort of shift into the burgeoning field of digital media and learning. So like now I work with the MacArthur Foundation, who I'm sure you all know have their $50 million initiative looking at digital media and learning, and kind of looking at games to foster learning. So as somebody said earlier, you know, games are on the ascent. It's no longer this closeted thing that people do. It's now something, you know, video games have become mainstream culture. And I do feel like I've spent a good number of years now kind of trying to put in the mainstream the idea of ways that we can use games to teach and learn and do things that we would all genuinely think of as being pretty positive. Some of the thinking that I have found the most interesting is ideas that have come out of this space that people call gaming literacies. I don't know how familiar people are with that. And probably the most intriguing idea that I found out of that is this idea that games foster something called systems thinking, which is understanding how complex dynamic systems work, because when you play a video game, you're engaging with a complex dynamic system, you're engaging actively with the processes of a system as opposed to when you read a book or when you read a movie. That's kind of what separates the video game as a medium from other kinds of forms. And so I've been really, really interested in systems thinking for a couple of years. You know, a system, a complex system, you know, complexity doesn't mean the opposite of simple. It refers to a level of interconnectedness. So a system is a set of interrelated parts that together form something bigger than the parts themselves. So, you know, a video game is a system when you're playing Mario Brothers and you jump up in the air, you might get a key, and then the key allows you to go into a door, and the door going through that allows you to get small, which allows you to do something else. So you start to realize that cause and effect, the instinct that I had at the beginning, that everything affects everything else. Global warming is another great example of a complex system. When you drive your SUV in Boston or in Manhattan, it affects the air, which then ends up affecting the ice caps, which affect the polar bears, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I think there's this increasingly understanding realization that we live in a world of systems. The world itself is a system, the body is a system, and that understanding how systems work might be a really valuable thing for kids to learn. And so there's, I've done stories a couple times on, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Katie Salon's school, Quest to Learn, which is the whole idea is to foster, to use games and game making, some of what Colleen was talking about this morning, to foster systems thinking. And over the years, even as I've been, I wouldn't say promoting, because as a journalist, that's not really your job. You really are observing. And even as I've been going around talking about systems thinking and thinking about systems thinking, I've had this thing nagging in the back of my head that there was a dark side to gaming literacy and to all of this excitement about digital media and learning and this sort of everybody being so STEM. I understand why it's so important and everything, but there's this feeling that there was something that we were forgetting about, or maybe even like a danger inherent in this. And it made me go back to a time when I was still writing my book, and I was walking around the game developers conference, and I was, again, always having this question, always thinking, show me the games of your children, I'll show you the next 100 years. And I was always thinking, what are we fostering? What are we fostering here? And I remember I had this really kind of horrifying epiphany. It's going to sound a little strange, but I was walking around the game developers conference, and I thought, oh my God, I suddenly had this vision of what kind of future we're going into and what kind of people we're creating. And it's people who resemble the profile of people who have Asperger's or low spectrum autism. And that kind of freaked me out. Now, am I saying that video games make you have autism? No, that would be a ridiculous thing to say. I'm not saying that there's a cause and effect. Nobody knows what causes autism, but one of the defining characteristics is that it starts very early developmentally, probably before you're even exposed to video games. But I am saying something more than just autism as a metaphor. I think if you look at the profile of low spectrum autism and Asperger's, and again, I do want to make that distinction because if you know anything about autism and Asperger's, there's a really big difference between Asperger's and fully people really at the high end of the autism spectrum. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the low end of the spectrum or Asperger's. And so I kept thinking about this, and I didn't really say anything to anybody because that's not really the kind of thing that you want to go around and tell people. And then I stumbled across a book by an autism expert by the name of Simon Baron-Cohen, who is also Sacha Baron Cohen's cousin. And he said this really interesting thing that kind of made me think, well, maybe I wasn't so crazy after all, which is, he says, and there's a problem here, but so he wrote a book called The Essential Difference, and he hypothesized that there are two kinds of brains. And he says that one is predominantly a male brain and one is predominantly a female brain. And I don't want to get into a big conversation about male and female and biological and, that opens a can of worms I don't really want to get into. But let's just say there's two kinds of brains he puts out there. One is a brain that is predominantly hardwired for empathy. The other is for understanding and building systems. You can probably guess which is the male and which is the female in his hypothesis. The autistic brain, he says, is the systems brain gone haywire. Autism is essentially an empathy disorder. And so I started thinking about this systematizing brain. So the systematizing brain is obsessed with understanding the underlying rules behind how a system works. which is the same thing that people who are proponents of systems thinking and how important it is talk about why systems thinking is so great. So in the systematizing brain, if you say it's March 22nd is a Tuesday, they're going to be able to tell you that what day of the week November 22nd is. Why? Because they so, on such a deep level, understand the rules that govern the calendar system that they can do that calculation. But that same person is not going to know that the person next to them is upset until they start screaming or crying, right? So I started thinking about this question of empathy. And I found myself starting to feel like that there's almost this, that there's a danger, maybe it's too, well, no, I don't think it's too strong a word, but that there's almost a danger in the idea of pushing forward these new ideas without remembering what we might be leaving behind. And that empathy, I would say, is an extremely important part of intelligence. And I do start to worry as we move forward into these ideas about gaming literacies and the importance of systems thinking, that if we don't stop and remember that that is not a complete picture, that that is one type of personality, but is it a personality that we want to be the personality of the future? Because when you take that to its further extent, you get to a kind of dystopian place, right? And I think that, it's something about rationality taken too far as a kind of madness, right? Like, you can understand why it's important to understand the rules that govern a system. I mean, when you think about the beginning of science, right? It took us out of the dark ages. You start to understand how the world around you works. It's liberating, it's empowering, it's freeing. But if there's too much focus on the rules, if there's too much focus on the systems and the way things work, and not enough focus on people and how they are, you're actually moving into a really dangerous place. So I think that systems thinking without empathy, you start to see, like, I mean, not to go too overboard, but someone like Eichmann was probably a really good systems thinker without really a lot of empathy. And when you think about most of, or to take it into sort of the political realm, you start to think about sort of really oppressive regimes, right, that are sort of obsessed with the idea of creating systems and sets of rules, but that there's not a lot of movement for people inside them. And that really, when you think about it, the great travesties of history are rarely committed by people who have a surplus of empathy. Now, systems thinking to me is a really beautiful idea. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do this, but I think that what I feel like I observe, both in my own work, seeing ideas coming and going, and also if you look through history at all, is that you very often see really good ideas run off and taken too far. I mean, the teachings of Jesus Christ, great. The Catholic Church in the medieval times, less great, right? The idea that people should be able to govern themselves and not be governed by an autocratic power, great idea. The terror after the French Revolution, less good idea. So I do think that it's this, I find myself often sort of playing this role, I feel like, of being like, everybody just relax. Like, it's somewhere in the middle, right? We have to have some kind of balance. So I do find myself that it's sort of ironic that I've spent, I feel like, the last 5 years kind of helping the mainstream understand these really important ideas that are coming out of thinkings about games and gaming literacies. And now I find myself feeling sort of nervous about it. But I don't want to live in a world where a profile that very closely resembles the profile of low spectrum autism or Asperger's is the personality of the future. Although I should say that I'm not denigrating people with Asperger's or low spectrum autism. In fact, there's a whole movement going on right now of people with that diagnosis sort of claiming, well, this is my personality, and it's It's not a disorder, and of course we all know diseases are socially constructed, and until 1973 it was a disease to be gay. So it's very possible that this is going to be a personality, but I don't want it to be the personality. So I guess, I always also, I should have said at the beginning, I much prefer a conversation to actually standing up and lecturing. I prefer to just kind of give my observations and then see what other people have to say. So I just want to end by saying that, everyone likes a catchphrase. My concern is that we're going to have an empathy deficit. And you guys are the people who are sort of creating the media that's going to be raising our children. And it's worth considering what kind of people that we're raising, and as we move forward to embrace some of these ideas, how are we not going to forget these other things that are also very important. I feel like I have a lot more that I could say about it, but I kind of want to stop and see what other people have to say and answer questions or have a general conversation, see if that makes sense to anybody or no.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Alex, I've been giving a lot of thought to that because one thing, I am in the spectrum, and I have a son that's in the spectrum as well.
Talk a little bit louder, I can't hear you.
So I've been giving a lot of thought to that over the last 10 years.
A lot of thought to that?
A lot of thought to the conundrum between empathy and systems thinking over the last 10 years. Because for one thing, I am in the spectrum, and I'm the parent of a child in the spectrum, high function. And one of the interesting things that I think is happening, because I entirely agree with you that there is such a thing as taking a concept like system thinking and taking it to the extreme. I think that a big thing in the Nuremberg trials was precisely this idea of objectivity of science being taken to its extreme, right? And trying to understand in the name of science, or applying in the name of science methods that are entirely unethical and immoral. I would like to ask you what you think, or whether you think the trend in play that has this tremendous social component, the rise of the Zyngas of the world, is actually in some ways a pushback towards that perspective of systems thinking. Because I think there's many ways of doing systems. There's a mechanical way of doing systems, but there's also a more organic way of thinking about systems. And perhaps that's a way of thinking about empathy and games.
So the question part is, what is the social aspect of it?
Yeah, whether you think that this social aspect, this very strong social aspect that's now being influxed in games, has a relationship of trying to build empathy, or have some component of empathy into that system.
This topic is so complicated. You can probably tell I'm struggling with it a little bit because I've been thinking about this in the back of my mind for years and years and years, and I've never really quite figured out how to articulate it exactly. Because anything I say, then I think, well, there's these 5 other things that kind of counterbalance that. So let me think how to address that. I don't think that inherently having a social aspect is going to bring empathy. I mean, gladiators had a social aspect, right? They were in there together to kill each other. Or, but it was a social game. It was not an isolated game. Or competitive sports, it's not that you're going to kill each other, but that you're opposed to the other person. I'm not sure it does build empathy. I think that's absolutely a natural question to ask, and when I've raised these ideas with people, other people have asked me that. I do think, the thing that I think about is play. Zimmerman, you're right in front of me, and I always use your definition, but I always get it slightly wrong. That play is defined by, have you guys all read the rules of play? Eric Zimmerman, who's talking next, and Katie Salon, who are big influences on my thinking, wrote a really wonderful book called The Rules of Play, and they talk about how play is the movement within free movement within a more rigid system. So I think that when you're thinking about systems thinking and designing games to foster learning and things like that, the play aspect is what could save us. And I even sometimes find myself, in work that's come out of MIT, they talk about how play is one of the literacies of the 21st century, and I'm really happy to see that. Because I think as we live in a world increasingly complex, the global economy is a system, right? We all witnessed a huge system meltdown in 2008. If we'd understood systems a little bit better, maybe we would have been able to prevent it, or maybe we would have been able to get ourselves out of it a little bit better. We also live in a world increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence systems, right? Everything that we do is reacting with some giant artificial intelligence system that most of us have no idea how it works at all. If we're not able to play, which is push back against the rules of these systems, that's the difference between being oppressed and free in the future, in my opinion. Did that begin to address your question? Yeah.
Thank you for raising and provoking, because these are the kind of conversations we need to have if we're taking on the responsibility of making media for kids. Yeah. It's so formative. I think it's important to follow a little bit more on from what Alex said. I'd like to push back against the idea of counterposing empathy and systems thinking.
Okay.
Because I think that systems thinking is capable of being mechanical and reductionist, which I think is to your point. But I also think that systems thinking is capable of being holistic and empathetic. And some people would take it to, would describe it also as spiritual, and however that is, which is we live in a living system. We're part of a living system. And actually the great philosophical and spiritual traditions often meet up with the great scientific traditions in understanding that actually we live in an indivisible, living, active system of which we're just kind of arbitrarily separated component.
Yep.
And that kind of systems thinking, to me, is actually critical, that we both need to understand the complexity of climate, of economic systems, of the fact that an economic system is actually integrally tied to an ecological system. We need to understand the scientific understanding of that, but also that there's an incredibly empathetic and emotional component without which we're not able to actually do anything effective about it. And I think as creators of media, these are the things we do need to think about. How is it that we encourage that? Sometimes people are on screens, so we need to learn how to use screens. We have to learn how to get them off of screens. We need to make them learn how to speak their own voice and hear other people's voices in what they're creating and in the games they play. There are games that we can play that can be about, as earlier, about creating social change and about helping out other people and about creating social movements. And I think all of these are possibilities, but I thank you because I think these are the essential conversations that need to inform the great responsibility we're really taking on in making this happen.
I'm really glad you made that comment. I was gonna kind of speak to that a little bit, for me, starting to see to conceptualize the universe as a system has actually been a hugely meaningful thing for me. And it was a big epiphany when I was like, wait a minute, systems thinking is essentially a holistic point of view, exactly like you said. I always joke with my friends that I want to start a new religion for people who don't believe in God, and it'll be called systemology, right? Because it's basically you worship the complexity of the system, right? And that it's a non-dualist perspective where you realize but you are this integral part of this vastly complex system, and it's kind of a beautiful, wow. What?
That's basically what Buddha did.
Right, exactly. When I say I'm going to start a religion, my boyfriend always says, yes, it's called Buddhism. Yeah, for sure. I totally actually agree with that. So, but I guess maybe I should have spoke a little bit more about, some of the things that I think can go wrong with systems thinking. The way that Simon Baron-Cohen says that the systems thinking brain is one kind of brain, but that autism is that brain kind of gone haywire. There often is an obsessive component, sort of a tunnel vision, which I feel like when I was deep in exploring video games, I saw a lot, that I do think that they can foster this sort of, some of the other characters I saw, it's system thinking, it's being incredibly goal-oriented to the point, sometimes I think of tunnel vision, and I think that's a dangerous mindset to foster, to have people walking around like this. Again, that's how you get the Eichmanns, right? They're perfectly designing this system to destroy human beings. So I just think it's something that needs to be really thought about and considered.
You just started to get into the answer to my question, but
Oh, sure.
my question is a little bit about the mechanisms for this kind of change, and whether or not it truly is this, one side versus the other. And, is there something inherently less social about the social, or less empathetic about the social experiences we do have in these sort of game worlds? Is that part of it, or what have you thought about these sort of mechanisms for what's causing this?
I'm not sure what you mean. Will you rephrase that?
Yeah, so why is it that one is coming at the expense of the other? What's the change? Like, what's the reason? Or are there several?
I don't know that I have an answer to that. I would say that, I guess the thinking is that there's sort of two natural tendencies that you might have again, working basic. I'm a journalist, so I don't really know anything. It's always a joke, I know who to call, So I read other people's stuff, I listen to other people. So what I understand is that there's essentially two tendencies that you can have, right? And one is to have this brain that's sort of naturally empathetic, and one is to be a little bit more naturally systems oriented. So what I worry about is that we all know that the games that we create is going to create the people of the future. It's a huge responsibility, I think, creating media for children. Are we fostering one kind of personality at the expense of the other?
I wanted to ask you about how this plays out when you think about role-playing games, because I think that many children understand other people's perspectives and become more empathetic through playing different role-playing games, and that there isn't necessarily always a systems-based learning that goes on, but sometimes an empathy that they're learning from the game playing as well.
That's interesting. I'm not an expert in role-playing games. My sense with role-playing, I guess you could make that argument. My sense with role-playing is people are trying out different identities and working through issues of their own personality and their own life through taking on different identities, which, I guess that sort of fosters empathy. Is that sort of what you mean? Understanding different ways of being, thinking about different ways of being. I tend to think role-playing is probably a pretty healthy activity.
All right, last question, Stacey.
Great talk. So this is really more of a question for the group in terms of what we all do and the field that we're in and how we're here, and building off what you're saying. Empathy is something that we develop over time, and that kids are developing from zero to, we're still working on it all the time. And I'm wondering for the folks in this room, since in development there are lots of things that influence empathy, but one is the ability to mirror other people's feelings, and that starts in infancy, and it's very, very early, and that's why we make silly faces at babies and they make silly faces back. And also, as kids get more sophisticated, the ability to take other people's perspectives. And I'm wondering, just for the group, what kinds of tools or games, building off your role-playing comment, but for the youngest children, do we think that there are digital experiences out there that help kids either mirror other people's experiences or take other people's perspectives? Because those are really the building blocks that lead to empathetic behavior.
I can shout.
Nope.
Oh, okay. So we were whispering about the causality of games and the behavior describing versus the reverse. I'm unconvinced of that causality. And in terms of what games, I would think that any game that has a character requires you to in some way relate to that character, even if that character is holding a gun, even if that character is you holding the gun, that you're required to be in a different place, that you're adopting a different way moving through the world, and that requires empathetic thinking. When I think of system thinking in games, being very concrete, I think about the enormous complexity of the system you have to do in World of Warcraft to figure out all the different pieces. But when I'm thinking of games that I would associate with the least caring games, are ones where I have to do the most, taking myself out of myself to be in this other world. Usually the most violent games require me to be the most somebody else than a game that is closer to my own philosophy or thinking or values in my ordinary life. So I have a hard time with the causality of those.
Just to be clear, I definitely was not saying there's causality between playing video games and autism.
But the causality between playing video games and promoting system thinking over empathetic thinking is not a causality that immediately makes sense to me, and I would love to hear more of that perhaps outside of this stuff.
Yeah, we'll chat afterwards.
Maybe somebody else has more responses to the kinds of games that promote empathy.
I think we have got the time signal, right?
All right, but one last thing, Scott, will you just talk for 1 second about the workshop you're doing?
Well,
We have time for that. We'll make it
I wasn't going to
last
say
long.
anything. I wasn't going to use them, but there is one of the workshops, and my name is on it, and I'll do a little bit, but it's really my colleague Caitlin Feely will be leading us in exercising role-playing as a way of actually exploring history, and but also empathy. We'll get you some stuff.
Okay, thank you so much.